I have to tell you, I've been basically on the road speaking now since August, pretty much. But this is the first time I've been invited to speak where Marion said, and here's your bottle of wine. We want it done by the time you're done with the speech. So hopefully I'll still be speaking coherently by the end of this little time. Anyway, thank you for having me here. It's a real pleasure. It has been a great 2-3 days with Mike and Marion, great people, friends. It's really been a lot of fun. So this is what makes it all worthwhile. I think I have to say, I've never spoken at a dinner like this when I'm supposed to be eating. I feel like I'm going to be interrupting you. So I think what they want me to do is sort of speak in 3 parts. And when they bring out the food, you can just tune me out, and that'll be good. But here's what I thought I would do. A little bit of sort of a history talk the first, and sort of put today's treatment in a historical context. And that will even be a little bit of a look at how well we're doing today, or not doing so well. And then the second part of the talk, looking at sort of the meat and bones of this book I just wrote, titled Anatomy of an Epidemic, and look at what science tells us about how medications, how they act on the brain, and how they affect long-term outcomes. And then the third part will be sort of an optimistic story and a lot of discussion about what might we do differently once you sort of look at this story and sort of build a better future. Because I think everybody here that's really why we're here. Right? Because something's not quite going right with how we're conceiving of, quote, psychiatric distress and how we're treating it. And that's pretty apparent. Okay, a little bit about my background, how I came to this. I've been writing about medicine and science as a journalist going back to the late 1980s. So I was a reporter on a newspaper, beginning in 1988 really. I became the medical reporter for that newspaper, so I was a newspaper journalist for a while. In 1994, it's okay, some of it. In 1994, I left daily newspapers for a short period of time to become director of publications at Harvard Medical School. After that, I actually co-founded a publishing company that reported on the pharmaceutical industry, the development of new drugs, some of the business aspects of that. And then in 1998, we sold that company and I began writing books. The point of this is I have a very mainstream background in terms of as a journalist covering medicine. It couldn't be more mainstream. Trained very much in this story of evidence-based medicine. Medicine should follow the dictates of evidence-based. So that's the value that I was sort of trained in. My entry into writing about psychiatry began in 1998 in a very, very backdoor manner. What happened was when I had that company, which was a company called Center Watch, we tracked new drugs coming to market, and we really were covering a lot about the business aspects of this whole business. But the atypical antipsychotics came to market in the mid-1990s is when this is Risperdal, Zyprexa, said to be so much better than the old drugs. So what I did is I asked through a Freedom of Information request to get the FDA reviews of those new drugs. And there's a couple things I found. One, that the FDA said, listen, these new drugs are no better than the old drugs. That was the FDA review at that time. In fact, Risperdal, do you have Risperdal? Is that the same name? Risperidone, okay. It's the same drug that we have.
And you have coffee cups with that name written on them.
You have coffee cups, that's right, they bring it. Anyway, Risperdal helped kick off this atypical revolution, but if you actually look what the FDA said, there's no evidence that this drug is better or safer, more efficacious than the old one, and I was really stunned by that, because that was so at odds with the scientific literature and the story being told in the press. But more importantly, I started looking at the deaths. There was actually quite a few deaths in the trials of the atypicals. In fact, when I went through the data that had been submitted to the FDA, I found that 1 in every 135 people treated with an atypical in those trials died. And there was no mention of those deaths. So what happens is I then went to the Boston Globe and said, listen, who I had written for as a correspondent on and off, even while I had this company, I'll do a series on abuses of patients in psychiatric research settings. And so I did this with another person. We did a 4-part series. That series got a lot of attention. But the key thing here is as I did that series, I completely believed in the medical model. So I believed that schizophrenia was caused by too much dopamine in the brain. I believed that antipsychotics worked by balancing dopamine in the brain. So I had a completely conventional understanding of schizophrenia and psychosis itself. And in fact, in that series, this is a 4-part series, one of the things we looked at were studies in the past where they had withdrawn people with schizophrenia from their medications. And we presented that as an extraordinary ethical abuse. And the reason we presented it as an ethical abuse is because as a reporter, whenever I called people up, theyid, these drugs are like insulin for diabetes.
Yes.
And I said, you've all heard that. But I believed it, so I said, well, then why would you withdraw the drugs from schizophrenia patients? You would never withdraw insulin from a diabetic. The beginning of this journey that led me first to write a book called Mad in America, and then Anatomy of an Epidemic, began while I was reporting that series. What happened was two things. One, I came upon some studies done by Harvard Medical School researchers that looked at long-term outcomes for schizophrenia patients. This study was reported in 1994. They reported that outcomes had actually gone down in the past 15 years. I'm like, well, this makes no sense. We're getting better at understanding schizophrenia. How could the outcomes be going down? And even more importantly, said the number of people doing well long-term with schizophrenia in the modern age was now no better than it had been in 1900. And I'm like, when they put people in their showers and God knows what they did. And I'm like, well, that doesn't make any sense. So I called people up and they didn't give me a good explanation because, again, I was operating with this understanding we were uncovering the biological causes of schizophrenia and we had these drugs that fixed it. Then the other studies that set me out on this journey were done by the World Health Organization. So the World Health Organization, beginning in 1969, had conducted 2 studies that compared outcomes in 3 quote, developing countries, specifically India, Colombia, and Nigeria, with outcomes in the US, the UK, and 5 other developed countries. Basically rich versus poor, although they use the developers as developing. And each time they found that outcomes for schizophrenia patients, as diagnosed by Western doctors, were much, much better in the poor countries of the world. Particularly in India and Nigeria is where they were really superb. And they concluded, that, quote, living in a developed country is a strong predictor that you will never fully recover from schizophrenia. That was the one line that started me on this long journey, because I wanted to know why living in a developed country meant you wouldn't get well from schizophrenia. Especially since one of the things we're so proud of in the Western world is our medical advances. And when I came upon that, I started calling people, experts in the field. Why are outcomes better in India and Nigeria? They told me, well, the families like the patients better there. That's literally what they told me. Or the societies are more sort of tolerant and forgiving. And that may be true somewhat, but I also know stories about the rather remarkable abuse in certain places in developing countries. So I read the studies, and I read the studies, and one of them was like 100 pages long. And you find out that after the first study, which was a 5-year study, they had a hypothesis. The WHO investigators. They hypothesized the reason that people did better in the poor countries of the world was that they were more medication compliant. That they took their antipsychotics more regularly, and in the rich countries, people had these ideas about liberty, rebellion, and they didn't take their drugs. So with that hypothesis, and that sort of makes sense as a hypothesis, if you believe the drugs shape outcomes for the better, medication compliance would you'd expect it to be consistent. So they looked at medication usage in the second study, and here's what they reported. That in the poor countries, although maybe people were treated initially with antipsychotics, they weren't maintained on the drugs long term. That only 16% of the patients were regularly maintained on the drugs. And in fact, if you actually leave it, they said, we don't even believe that many patients were on the drugs, because many of them were telling us that, yeah, we're taking the drugs just to sort of mollify us, but that really wasn't happening. And of course, in the US and other rich countries, this was the standard of care. So you can see that I sort of had an intellectual crisis, so to speak. I've been reporting on medicine for good 10 years then. I was absolutely certain that these drugs fix chemical imbalances, and now I'm confronted with this data by a very well-respected organization that tells me this is not true, necessarily. So I really got a contract in 1999 to write Mad in America to explore this modern failure. Why is living in a developed country a strong predictor you will never fully recover? And once I began investigating that, and I'll go through this tonight, I felt I needed to understand the history of the treatment of, quote, the severely mentally ill. I needed to understand a little bit about conceptions of mental illness. And I figured that that past would become a foil for understanding the present. So maybe what we'll do real quickly is understanding that. We'll go through that past, because I think it is a foil for understanding the present, and it's also a way to understand and start thinking about where we are today, how we got here, and how we might make changes. So what did I do? I started figuring out, I went back to the colonial days, and it was called Mad in America, but obviously in the UK and the US there are some sort of twin paths. I went back to colonial days. The very first hospital in the United States was built in around 1760, and it was built with sort of very modern conceptions of madness, which we learned from you all, the mad doctors of Scotland and the mad doctors of the UK. And that was that those who are mad, by virtue of having lost their reason, have descended to a lower level. They're not really fully human, they've descended to the level of brutes. And that's a philosophical conception, because the idea is that reason is what separates man from the animals, right? And therefore, by virtue of having lost it, you descend to this level of brutes. And with that conception, the idea is that the mad were insensitive to heat and cold. They needed to be tamed, much like brutes. So you can read in medical textbooks, say, the value of whipping the mad. And in fact, when the first hospital opened in colonial days, this was in Philadelphia, they were looked over by keepers, in the same way you had keepers over the animals, and they had whips and that sort of thing. They were kept in these cells that were pretty much underground with straw, often naked, unheated. And on the weekends, the good people of Philadelphia could come there and pay a small, few pennies and get to look at the mad people put on display, much like coming to a zoo. So, and by the way, if you were a mad doctor, this is what you learned. And you can go read the medical texts of the, this is around 1750. You can read the texts of the mad doctors, and this is what they tell you. So, and by the way, they were quite confident that they had learned the biological causes of madness, actually. And some of the treatments they had were quite sure they were cures for madness. So, for example, Benjamin Rush is remembered as the father of American psychiatry. And he said that, let me make sure I did this right, madness is caused by too much blood rushing to the brain. Depression is caused by not enough blood rushing to the brain. So as a cure for madness, they would bleed you quite dramatically, and hopefully that would drain blood from the brain, and that was a biological cure. They'd also pour ice over your head to help cool down your brain. And you can read it, sort of a chemical imbalance theory, sort of a brain balancing theory. They would also, so for depression, you wanted blood to rush to the brain. They would do these spinning therapies. They put you on, and your feet would be at the middle of the spinning board, and the blood would rush out to your head, and that would fix your depression, because depression was caused by not enough blood to the brain. Anyway, the idea here is, the idea of balancing things goes way, way back. And they were quite sure that these were effective therapies. The first American therapy, which we then exported to the UK and elsewhere, was known as the tranquilizer chair. And by the way, I'm quite sure that the tranquilizer chair would pass FDA approval today in terms of its reduction of symptoms. So what they would do, no, I'm quite sure this is true. I mean, there's no question. In fact, I'm pretty sure it would beat antipsychotics. They would put people in the chair, and for 4, 8, 12 hours, 16, 20, 24, 28, people would be agitated. They'd bleed them. They'd pour ice over the head. And as Benjamin Rush said, after a certain period of time, the people did indeed calm down. And I'm sure they stopped saying crazy things, because if you've been bled copiously and you've been room, sort of in a chair for 18 hours. I'm sure you're quite exhausted. Anyway, if you put people in this chair today, did a BBRS scale, and came back 24 hours later, I think you'd see a reduction in your symptoms. And as Benjamin Rush said, this is a very effective therapy, and we now exported the tranquilizer chair, and doctors in the UK and Europe found it to be indeed a very effective therapy. The next big moment in history is when the Quakers arrive on the scene. The Quakers beginning, I think it's in 1792, and this is in York, England, it's here. They lose one of their members. One of their members goes to one of the asylums, maybe Bedlam, etc. That person is treated as an animal, dies, and so the Quakers say this: we don't know what causes madness, but we do know they're brethren. You see the difference there? They move from animals to brethren. And as brethren, we're going to treat them as such. And we're going to say, well, what do they need? They need good food, they need shelter, perhaps a glass of porter in the afternoon. And the idea is to assist nature and God in helping people recover. And this was the idea: you would build these retreats, an asylum in the best sense of the word, as a refuge from the daily stresses out in the countryside. And the idea is that you go out there, you walk on the gardens, you have exercise, just sort of creating a place for people to rest, so to speak, and where people would be treated with dignity and as brethren. And the idea of the most beautiful moment is this: if you read the original York text, they talk about this. We're going to hold up a mirror that tells not of a mad person, but of a person quite capable of being well. And the idea is they practically would dress well, they would be in nice bedrooms, there would be reading rooms, and so they're painting a picture of people of normalcy, so to speak. And in fact, what did they find in the early York Asylum? By the way, you can still go there in York. The original York Asylum that opened, I believe, in 1796. It's obviously expanded since then, but it's still on the same site. I'm not sure they're still practicing the same principles. What did they find? They find, in fact, that they had very little trouble with violence. They had very little problems with the staff, and they said this: the reason you get violence so often is when you're treating people as animals, or there's this opposition that happens. But as long as we're not in opposition, people become quieter, they become more manageable, etc. So they had very little trouble with violence. The other thing, and these are people, by the way, that are clearly quite crazy, so to speak, by any standard, that the craziness, in fact, often abated. So I'm sorry, but I forget the data, but certainly more than 50% in these early York Asylum were getting better after a year or so, especially the first episode. It's like crazy people, psychotic people, would get better, leave, and not come back. So it was a very optimistic, humanistic form of care. It was adopted in the United States beginning in 1812, and it became the form of care for the next 35 years in the United States. Small asylums, McLean Hospital in Boston is an early moral treatment asylum, etc. So we got these private asylums in different cities opened by the Quakers, and historians who have gone back. And by the way, these are people, the number of people being hospitalized is very tiny. And so, it's got to be the crazy people, so to speak. And historians have gone back and have found that first episode patients, regularly 50% would be out of the hospital within 12 months. So you have this vision of psychosis as sort of a episodic illness. You descend into it and often it gets better. The best long-term study was done out of Worcester Asylum in the United States. Let me see if I can get this right. Of the first episode cohort they studied from like 1945 to 1955, a big group of people, over 1,000 patients. 58% of that initial cohort were discharged and never again in the course of their lives re-hospitalized. Okay, so now they got back to, and I'm sure they were, many of them were eccentric, that sort of thing, but 58% never went back. Another 7% came back at least one time, and then the other 36% either died in the follow-up period or were re-hospitalized. as historians of America, and not me, have said those are the best outcomes we've ever had in the United States for treating, quote, lunatics, insane people, etc. And it's quite an optimistic vision because we clearly don't get those sort of long-term stay well rates today. What happened with that was known as moral therapy? What happened there was in the United States, and it's somewhat similar in the UK and all. We had a reformer named Dorothea Dix. Dorothea Dix was a woman who had her own breakdown in the 1850s. She goes to York. She's actually sort of nurtured back to health by the family that started the York Asylum. And she says, wow, this sort of humanistic care is great. I'm going to bring it back to the United States. And she becomes a great lobbyist. She goes to state legislatures, one after another, and says, listen, we don't have any form of care right now. In fact, many people, many small communities, they were just chaining them up, that sort of thing, or putting them in jail. This humanistic care works. And this was the first great public building projects in the United States, was to build asylums for, quote, the insane lunatics. And I have to say, the people in the 1850s and early 1860s, and you were doing some of this as well, I mean, these patterns are going down the same pathways. I obviously know the U.S. history better. The people responded with an incredible sense of compassion, I'd say. I mean, they taxed themselves to build these retreats out in the countryside, and they were very well appointed. If you look at how they were built with reading rooms, exercise places. The rooms were well appointed. They would have ballrooms in. Some of the best entertainment in the 1850s was in these asylums. People would come in and give talks. People from outside would want to come to the asylums or listen to talks, etc. But what happened? Once they became public facilities, people began dumping, the communities as a whole began dumping all sorts of people into these asylums. Elderly people that basically we would call have Alzheimer's today. People with end-stage dementia due to syphilis were there as well. Neurological disorders that have since been identified. And once they became these dumping grounds, they grew in size. They were supposed to be small initially, like 100, 200 people. They rapidly became 500 people, 750 people, 1,000 people. And once that happened, the good outcomes started going down. People would come in, there would no longer be these reading rooms, there's no longer be exercise. Next thing you know, the outcomes deteriorated, and by 1892, there was a meeting of the American Association of Superintendents, and they said, moral therapy has failed. And we now have to embrace the medical models. This actually goes back to 1892. But you see what really failed? What failed was these big institutions where you were dumping people with all sorts of unknown disorders, many of them indeed with Alzheimer's. They were sort of like nursing homes at the time. And that's what got mixed up. And unfortunately, we lost this sense, and it's really never been recovered, that humanistic, and I think this is a theme that you all are attempting to recover, is that humanistic care, people that says people are brethren who are suffering with psychiatric distress and treated like brethren, can go into very serious states, whether it be psychosis, whatever, and come out and do well. And we've lost that memory, and it goes back. You see it real clearly in the 1800s. What happened after that? The next big thing. The UK, got started what was known as eugenics. So we have Darwin with his extraordinary discoveries of evolution, the origin of the species, which tell you that species can evolve. That also, Darwin doesn't write about this, but obviously implicit is that the human species can evolve. And then it's Darwin's cousin named Sir Francis Galton says, well, if human species can evolve, there are certain people with bad genes and you need to prevent them from breeding, and there are certain people with good genes and you need to encourage those to breed. And he did a study of basically people at the top of English society, and he said, look at these people who have good genes. Of course he wasn't.
Me and my cousins.
Me and my cousins had good genes. Didn't look at, sort of the wealth that came with this certain standing in society. So he publishes this, and we also get, a little bit of understanding of how seeds work, how you can combine seeds and create new seeds. And so eugenics becomes this idea of how to improve society. Now, the idea started in the UK with Sir Francis Galton, but it was we in the United States who really embraced this idea of eugenics. And we were the first society to begin adopting and incorporating into law eugenic policies. So beginning in 1896, think about this. Eugenics tells you that people need to be rated, right? That we have these very capable people with good genes. It's called germplasm at the time. And at the top we're going to see, well, we're going to put certain people, and then we're going to go down, and who are we going to have at the bottom? Well, you can see what's going to happen in the United States. In the bottom we're going to put the newly freed blacks, and then we're going to put the mentally ill. And then you can look in the United States, we're going to have the WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants at the top. We're going to put the Italians or whatever, people, little brown skin in the middle, blacks at the bottom. But at the very bottom is the insane. That's the lowest of the low. So, what do the eugenicists say? They say that the insane people have these genes that are a threat to society, and we need to remove that gene. We've got to keep them from breeding. So, what do we first do? 1896, the first, and you know how the U.S. is, we're this federation of states, and states pass their own laws. So the first state to pass a law preventing the insane from marrying, I think it was, it's been a while since I've talked about this, it may have been Connecticut, but it's around 1896. And then other states passing this law, and virtually every state says the insane can't marry. So when you went to the United States to fill out your marriage license, they said, "Are you insane?"
If you're insane, you said yes.
But what they said, unfortunately, is people are prejudiced, for themselves, and so the insane don't acknowledge they're insane. So this anti-marrying law isn't working. So what they said is we need to segregate the insane in insane asylums. So we need to put them there, and we need to keep them there, and not discharge them, because we need to remove them during their breeding years. And you can chart this. The discharge rates, once these eugenic policies come in, they decline big time. You go in, and you just don't come out. And you'll see how this plays out. Now, even after that, that was seen as pretty good. But then people talked about, well, let's make this permanent. So let's sterilize the mentally ill. Again, this starts in the United States, the first state to authorize the forcible sterilization. I think it's Indiana, around 1906. They passed this. Now, this obviously does raise constitutional questions. Can you forcibly sterilize somebody? Finally, it comes to this U.S. Supreme Court in 1926. And the U.S. Supreme Court says, yes, you may forcibly sterilize these genetic defectives. So that really gets the sterilization going. California implements it in sort of sterilization policies. And by the end of World War II, there are something around 45,000 people in state hospitals in the United States who've been forcibly sterilized. There was one other country that really adopted this. Do you know which country? Germany. Hitler comes to power, of course, in 1933 under a eugenic policy. He looks to the United States. There was actually some scientific commissions that went back and forth. So Germany people came to the United States to look at how we did the forcible sterilization. After that, these were called scientific exchange programs. The people from Germany went back, enacted their own sterilization programs. And they actually, Nazi Germany said, they thought their programs were better than ours because, in fact, they had a court process for bringing people up and saying this. In other words, there was some sense that there was due process going on, missing from the United States program. Just so you understand, I don't know the attitudes in the UK wholly at this time. And you did not adopt forced sterilization here, right? You never did.
Not forced, but I would use the word coerced in many times, but...
Really?
But anyway, you can see the stigmatization that's going on here, the sort of devaluing of human beings that is going on here. We did, by the way, you can read eugenic tracts in the 1930s in which they're complaining that the Germans are beating us at our own game. We needed to up our sterilization. It's also important to note this is not a sort of just a few crazies doing this. This was promoted by Ivy League universities, Harvard, they would have eugenic studies, MIT. This was something, Forbes magazine did a survey in around 1936, 37. Something like 70% of Americans favored forced sterilization of the mentally ill. It was a popular policy. So now you can see what we got going on. We're keeping people in, we're sterilizing them. As early as 1921, I found a newspaper in Connecticut where the Connecticut legislators were brought out to a mental hospital. And they brought forth this crazy person, and he was seen as a candidate, in fact, for euthanasia. And the New York Times wrote about maybe euthanasia would be good of the insane. It was as considered, would this be a humane thing to do? I say this, obviously we never did this, but it does speak, again, to this devaluing that was going on. And then, of course, when the Holocaust starts, it begins not with Jews, but it begins with the mentally ill. And that's what
Gypsies?
What's that?
Gypsies.
Well, the very first were, in fact, the insane. So the actual, I hate to say this, but the perfection of the gases was done on the mentally ill. And there were psychiatrists involved in this program. The next thing that happens is, so we have this...
You sound surprised.
I'm not going to go there. We have this devaluation, this extreme devaluation. And then in the 1930s, when we have this devaluation, we get these new therapies that enter asylum medicine. They're insulin coma therapy, they're metrazole convulsive therapy, and electroshock, and ultimately lobotomy. These were all seen as highly effective therapies. If you read the press in the United States at this time, Reader's Digest, it was that madness has been discovered. You can run someone through convulsive therapy, and it just eliminates the madness. They sit up, they talk sense, boom. This is like this extraordinary medical advance. Electroshock, by the way, do you know this was invented basically as a better way to do convulsions than using metrazole, which was a poison? It really was started partly as a more consistent way to cause these convulsions, were thought to induce seizures, which were thought to drive out schizophrenia. Adjudged to be highly effective, seen as miracle brain surgery. Then lobotomy comes in. Lobotomy, of course, is invented by a Portuguese neurologist, Igaz Moniz, 1939. He also, when he writes it up, he talks about people restored to sanity right away. We get in the United States a guy named Walter Freeman, who starts going around to hospitals around the country. He perfected a technique for doing lobotomy in about 10 minutes. He would drive ice picks through the eyes. He would lay the person out, and they would just literally, Walter Freeman would go into a hospital, review the medical records, and he'd pick out, say, 50 people to do the surgery that morning, and they would run them up one by one. And on the table, he would drive the ice picks in, scramble the lobes, and the idea is they would go away cured. Just a... The important thing here is, by the way, Marion told me, if you go long tonight, you're yanked off the stage, so I better hurry up.
Food's about
10 minutes. How fast?
10 minutes.
All right, so 10 minutes. Anyway, the New York Times, when it was writing about lobotomy, said these new surgeons have learned to neatly pluck madness from the brain as cleanly. They were like watchmakers. They knew all the inner workings of the brain. They figured out where madness was located, and they said the frontal lobes, it seems, are useless appendage. They don't really lose anything when you knock out the frontal lobes, but madness goes. In the United States, where we again were real pioneers of lobotomy, you can read people say that lobotomy can only help. Sometimes it doesn't work. It's ineffective. There really, if you look at when they first did the assessment, there were 3 assessments. Ineffective, no harm done, so-so, and miracle surgery. So it became seen as something of a no-risk surgery, and there was time that it was even recommended for young women in college that were just feeling a little bit depressed. And you can read the things. They were young, it was women more. The women were told to bring in sunglasses. You could come in, have your frontal lobe scrambled and then go away for the day. And just so you know this, that there's a little bit of thing here. So in 1949, Igaz Muniz wins the Nobel Prize in Medicine for inventing this miracle surgery. So what's going on here? How come was it seen as so effective? Well, you got to read the text by Walter Freeman. Because Walter Freeman did great follow-up work, fantastic follow-up work. And here's what he said. These people, in essence, don't have much worth at the beginning, right? So he would say, if we change this person who's sort of psychotic and difficult into some, if we knock them down to a lower level, sort of like a level of a domestic pet, that was seen as a good outcome. So if we could take someone who was agitated in the hospital and allow them to go home and sort of stare out the window, that was good. And that became part of the way they assess the value. And you can read things where they say, like, you know, these people used to worry about, like, what the history of America might have been like if the Indians had won or something like that. Or these people might have used to play these piano concertos, and now they just mostly sit quietly and look out the window. That's a good change. But you can see there's a value underlying this assessment. Real quickly, I got about 8 minutes. When the antipsychotics first come into, introduced into asylum medicine, they were seen as providing a chemical lobotomy, that transforming people in a somewhat similar way that the surgery did. There's a reason for that. The Thorazine and other standard neuroleptics, what they do is they profoundly block dopamine in the brain. The frontal lobes work off of a dopaminergic pathway, so if you're profoundly blocking that, you are diminishing frontal lobe function. All right, so that brings us to the modern era. You can see actually when you look at it this way, there is a bit of a connection. See this? I mean, in other words, the drugs initially are seen as not as antipsychotics, but providing this sort of same change. It's in the early 1960s, a study is done by the NIMH, and they say, wow, it's a classic randomized trial, 6-week trial. It's 300 patients, 9 hospitals, 3 groups get drug, 1 group placebo. They say after 6 weeks, the drug-treated patients, in fact, the psychotic symptoms have abated much more than in the drug-treated group. And they say, these drugs aren't just tranquilizers, major tranquilizers, they're antipsychotics. In other words, they're fixing something wrong in the brain. They're like an antidote, like an antibiotic. And this is the moment we get new language. And we get the launching of the psychopharmacological revolution. We get antipsychotics, we get antidepressants, and we get anti-anxiety agents. And now it fits into the antibiotic model of medicine. It is key to remember here, antibiotics come in after World War II. And they do transform medicine. Think about this. We have these bacterial infections that you can now knock out. We have magic bullets. And so everybody wants their magic bullets. I completely understand this, and these were psychiatry's magic bullets. And if you can read conventional histories of psychiatry, such as, and this is in the UK as well as the US, but in the US it's a book called The History of Psychiatry by Edward Shorter. He says, the introduction of Thorazine, antipsychotics, was as profound a leap forward in psychiatry as the introduction of penicillin was in infectious medicine. So this extraordinary leap forward, extraordinary increase, and this launches this revolution. It makes it possible to empty the institutions. You go forward with this story of the psychopharmacological revolution, and you can see this, for example, in a book or a publication done by our U.S. Surgeon General in 1998, who's David Satcher. He says, prior to 1955, we lacked treatments that would prevent chronicity, prevent people from becoming chronically ill. Then we got these drugs, and now we have this vast array of safe and effective treatments. And then he says this revolution has unfolded in 2 stages. We had the first generation drugs. Then in 1988, we got Prozac and the SSRIs. You call it Prozac in Europe, that's right. And then we got the atypical antipsychotics, Risperdal. And then we got the better benzos, supposedly. And therefore this revolution has two steps. First drugs, and then you have these better drugs. And these better drugs arose from an understanding of the advancing knowledge about the biology of mental disorders. Great story, fits into the story of medical progress. And now I'm just about to leave you, so what do I do in anatomy of an epidemic? As a first step, if there's medical progress, you should expect the burden of mental illness on society to drop or at least stay the same. Because that's what normally happens when you get effective treatments for medical disorders. So what I did as the opening chapter is just look at the number of people on government disability from 1955 forward, and look at that as a per capita rate. In 1955, there were 560,000 people in the United States in state and county hospitals. You got to look, however, how many people had psychiatric diagnoses. It's about 360,000 people. That's a disability rate of about 1 in every 480 people. Now we do deinstitutionalize during that time, and now let's go to, and now the disabled mentally ill, quote, disabled mentally ill in the United States are kept on SSI and SSDI. This is a federal support program. You get a government check. I'm sure you have your own disability program. In 1987, that had grown to 1.25 million people in this first stage of the revolution, and that's a disability rate of about 1 in 180 people, so it's more than 2 times higher. Now, people might say, oh, that's an apples to oranges comparison. You had to be sicker to be in the hospital. Maybe you don't have to be as sick, so maybe that's not fair, okay? From 1987 forward, we have the same metric, right? We're not switching metrics. 1987 is when we really embraced the use of medications as the cornerstone of care. In the United States, our spending on psychiatric drugs rose from $800 million in 1987 to more than $40 billion in 2007. So we really love these new drugs. What happens to the disability numbers? They go from 1.25 million to 4 million. They triple during that time. That's at a per capita rate, it drops to about 1 in 70.
I bet the shareholders really like that.
What's that?
I bet the shareholders really like that.
The shareholders do like that. But you see why this raises a puzzle? Instead of seeing the burden of mental illness decreasing, it's rising. And notably so. So the disability rate's about 6 times what it was in 1955. Now I knew this data before I came somewhat, but I also looked at it a bit more. Iceland, which was my first stop on this tour, saw the same sort of thing from 1976 to 2000, a doubling of the disability rate. But you know what's really happened in Iceland since? Antidepressants became real popular, and you can look at the numbers beginning in about 1995 in Iceland. Since 1995, the incidence rate, the number of people going on disability each year in Iceland among adults, has tripled since 1995 to 2008, whatever it was. So antidepressants come in, and all of a sudden the disability rate, the number going on disability has tripled. Here in Britain, it tripled between 1985 and 1995. You have a measure, something called days lost or something like that due to disability. It tripled between 1985 and 1995. Unfortunately, I haven't seen your updated data, but I'm quite sure it is continuing to rise. And actually, you see this in country after country where the drugs become the cornerstone of care. By the way, it's not just psychotic disorders. Whenever you see countries embrace this paradigm of care, it's actually the mood disorders that really rise as a disability problem. It's depression, and then the other thing that you see with the widespread use of antidepressants is a bipolar group springs up. Suddenly bipolar becomes much more prevalent. Bipolar becomes a big driver of disability, and we'll talk about why that is. Finally, last thing, remember that how I got started with the good outcomes in the poor countries? Eli Lilly now has a new study of about 7,000 patients. As you know, psychiatry has been globalized, so since we're so good in the United States, we've been promoting the use of medications in Asia and Africa.
They really want to be developed countries.
They want to be developed.
Really.
And we bring their doctors to our meetings each year, and they go back, and this is the latest medicine. Well, the outcomes for schizophrenic psychotic patients in the poor countries of the world are now deteriorated to where they're basically like they are in the U.S. and other developed countries. So it's not that we rose, but they just published this data, and they said that now in the poor countries, where it used to be 70% would be working, now only about 20% are.
Yeah. I mentioned that to a psychiatrist once who used to work in Cameroon,
Right.
as well as working in the UK. And she said, yeah, but you don't understand, we're actually improving the quality of the life of these people. She used to go there in a sort of charitable fashion, and, sponsored by someone like EleMental.
How are we improving quality of life?
Well,